if you might for a moment comment on the current attempt to indict Donald Trump and what he continues to represent for, you might say, marginalized people, but he's an incredibly popular and populist figure.
Well, I read Victor Davis Hanson's book, The Case for Trump, which I would highly recommend to anyone who's interested in Trump as a phenomenon. And he pointed out, and I think quite rightly, and this is something for those who are sensible on the left to give some consideration to, that the Democrats, especially under Clinton, but it started with Obama, abandoned the American working class, regarded them essentially as deplorables, which is exactly the same thing that happened in Canada under Trudeau and Jagmeet Singh, and they turned to Trump. And it's not as if people don't understand that Trump is a bull in a china shop. And I think Robert F. Kennedy is in some ways the same sort of character, but they're actually calling for a bull in a china shop because increasingly people don't trust the overarching centralized institutions that have become too gigantic. You made reference earlier to the fact that there's no necessary reason for us to assume that the internet communication system and information exchange system that we've set up would necessarily tilt towards decentralization and universalization. I think that's absolutely true. It's very difficult to stop a political system from becoming tyrannical. That's the Tower of Babel situation, let's say, or degenerating into chaos. You know, we've seen that with online games. You know, some of those massive online games degenerated into absolute chaos because the rules by which they were constituted turned out not to engender a playable game. And we have no idea if the internet communication system we've set up is actually a playable game. We have no idea. Like, look, already we do know some things. About 35% of internet traffic is pornographic. And if you don't think that that's under the control of psychopathic criminals, you're a fool. And then there's absolute, what would you say, lawless West activity on the criminal financial fraud front. I don't think there's an older person in the Western world who isn't targeted once a week by criminals trying to steal their bank accounts. And then, so that's direct criminal activity. That's of the obvious type. Then there's all the online trolls who do nothing but cause trouble and sow divisiveness in their cowardly manner and with their LOL culture, trying to do nothing but cause trouble. And we know from the psychological research that those people are much likely to have dark tetrad characteristics. They're Machiavellian, narcissistic, psychopathic, and because that wasn't good enough, sadistic. And we have no control mechanisms for their proliferation online, right? In face-to-face, people like that get shut down right away, but they have absolutely free reign on the net. And I think not only does that poison the public square in a terrible manner, but it also indicates to people falsely that we're much more divided than we are.
Yes, it appears to me sometimes, Jordan, that anthropology and ethnographics suggest that we all live in manageable communities where the kind of narcissism and sadism that you describe cannot thrive because of the way that relationships break down when you encounter personalities of that type. There is no ability to regulate a culture at this kind of scale. And I know that what you believe in, it seems at least to me, that you believe in new ways of decentralizing power, both corporate and state. I wonder, are you saying something as significant as the nation project has had its demi-millennia, and that it's time to review even the findings and the treasures of the Westphalian Treaty? Is this a time where we review the way that we organize cultures and society? Because it appears to me that the reason that we have these great gargoyles and demons occupying the public stage, vivid caricatures, a vile, lurid and pornographic language, even outside of the erotic, is precisely because we are living in some outgrowth, in some exaggeration, in some unbearable amplification of the type of systems that we might live by. Industrialization, it seems, ultimately introduced a great deal of tyranny, as well as the miracles it delivered. Agriculture, perhaps the same could be said, but we have no contingency for the problems of scale that have been created by this new type of technology. And it seems to me that unless we introduce real measures, as you say, control mechanisms, that the tyranny now is appearing to be inevitable without significant and organized opposition.
Okay, so one of the things you said at the beginning of that was that when you extract relationships out of their local environment, you lose a regulatory function. You lose an implicit regulatory function. So imagine that, you and I have had multiple opportunities to communicate. And one of the things, and we want to sustain that. So one of the things that we do while we're communicating, we might be trying to make our individual points for our own particular purposes. Hopefully we're trying to do something like investigate the truth, mutually. But in any case, even if our own personal interests did creep into that, if we had any sense, our exchanges would be bounded by the realization that we're going to interact repeatedly for an indefinite amount of time into the future, right? And so that makes us instantly, the dyad that we form, that makes us instantly into an interacting and iterative community. Now, I believe that it's out of iterative interactions that fundamental morality emerges. And there's plenty of game theory that indicates precisely that. Now, see what happens to psychopaths and predators and parasites is that they sacrifice the possibility of a long-term relationship for immediate gratification. And that's not good for them, by the way, because they tend to be very unsuccessful people and they have to move from victim to victim very rapidly because people cotton on to their games. But they're not bounded by that necessity of responsible, iterated interaction, the same necessity that would govern you if you were in a long-term committed relationship or the relationship that you have with your children. And it's out of that morality springs. Now, if you eradicate that necessity, you disinhibit the psychopaths now, and the predators and the parasites. Now, here's why this is such a major problem, and it might be a deadly problem. So the biological struggle is an arms race between parasites and hosts, and always has been. And it's such a profound race that's why sex evolved. Sex evolved because there are creatures that replicate, even some lizards that can replicate essentially by cloning themselves. So they produce identical duplicates of themselves. But what happens is the parasites can optimize for their physiology and take them out. So sex mixes genes. Okay, so the reason I'm saying that is because the parasite problem is so deep and so profound that sex itself evolved as the method of replication to deal with it. Now, the online communication systems facilitate the parasites. And you don't need that many of them to take a society down, like the real radical types who would rather dance around in the chaos and who are in it only for their immediate self-gratification. They're a very small percentage of the population. Clinical data indicates about 3%. But the problem with that is that if they have free rein, they can take everything down. Like they did that in the Russian Revolution, for example. This happens.
That is pretty powerful stuff, Jordan Peterson. Sex emerges as a solution to parasitic entities to introduce a new level of complexity that can outrun this parasitic mentality. So what do you think, Jordan? Perhaps the problem is even larger than in enabling narcissistic, predatory and parasitic individuals. Perhaps it somehow enables an archetype to function. For example, the rather hacky analysis that a corporation behaves like a psychopath because it doesn't have individual culpability or the kind of morality that would evolve in an individual. What happens if that is further charged by the type of technology that we're discussing? What if it unlocks something even more powerful than individual psychopathy?
Well, you always ask the hardest questions, Russell, I would say, and that's very interesting. I mean, look, one of the things that's characteristic of the biblical corpus, and the biblical corpus is the narrative that lies at the bottom of all our narratives. One of the things it insists upon is an archetypal battle between what's known in the symbolic world, let's say, as the hostile brothers. And the original hostile brothers are Cain and Abel. And they're magnified up into Christ and Satan as the symbolic narrative progresses. And you see this reflected in all sorts of popular culture tropes. You know, every superhero has his associated supervillain. And those are all, you see that with Thor and Loki, and of course they're gods as well. And you see this reflected constantly, you say, with Batman and the Joker and Superman and Lex Luthor. It's a constant trope. Everyone knows it. James Bond always fights some supervillain and often nested in a whole pit of supervillains. And there is a notion that's relevant to what you described, that there's a battle on the spiritual level. So you could think of that as the level of abstraction between the spirit of Cain and the spirit of Abel. And the spirit of Cain is the man whose sacrifices are rejected. And there's an implication in the text that they're rejected because they're of second-rate quality. It's never made quite clear, but you know, everybody's sacrifices are rejected from time to time. You work hard, you do what you think you have to do, and fate doesn't deliver to you what you think you deserve. Now, you have two choices under those conditions. And one choice is to take a good look at yourself, check your presuppositions, reformulate yourself, allow part of yourself to die and be reborn, regenerate yourself and try again, or to shake your fist at the sky and curse God and become bitter and resentful and then murderous and then genocidal. And that's the temptation. That's the dual pathways that have laid themselves forward to human beings since the beginning of time. Now, you asked if there's something archetypal going on under the surface that we're seeing the reflection of. And I would say, well, there's always been something archetypal going on. That's in the nature of archetypes. There's always been a battle between these two modes of existence. But what happens in the midst of a technological revolution like the one we're in now is that it happens way faster and at a much larger scale. And maybe the outlines even become clearer. And you know, people are inclined at the moment to think conspiratorially. You know, they say it's as if there's a cabal behind the scenes maneuvering in a particular direction. And I would say there are micro cabals now and then acting out this archetypal pattern, but the conspiracy itself is actually a network of associated ideas that have an animating spirit within them that possesses people en masse, and they act in accordance with its dictates. If you read Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, for example, one of the great things he did, that was probably the fundamental contribution of his work, was to show that the horrors of the communist regimes weren't an anomaly consequential to the instantiation of a potentially valid system, but the inevitable consequence of a non-playable game. And so the communist system laid itself out according to a certain set of animating principles, and that turned into this genocidal massacre. The question is, so I know now, I'm writing a new book about this, I know now that the structure through which we look at the world is a story. If you describe the structure through which we look at the world, that's what a story is. That's why we value stories, because we need to know how to look at the world. So the empiricists and the rationalists were wrong. We cannot derive a picture of the world through mere reference to the facts, because there's one fact per phenomenon, and there's too many phenomena. We're awash in them. You have to arrange them hierarchically. That's what a story is. And once you know that, the next question obviously is, well, what's the correct story? And I would say we at least know that it's not the story of Cain, but plenty of people are playing that out. Bitter, resentful, nihilistic, chaotic, angry at the structure of existence itself for the implicit suffering, turning against humanity, and the cosmos for that matter, in their vengeful anger. And the problem with that, I can understand why that's justifiable, because lots of people suffer. But the problem with that is that it makes a bad situation into hell. And that seems like a bad idea if what you're trying to avoid is hell.